It's great to be with you. We first, as I said, went to Israel in 1963, which was before the Six-Day War. And at that time, the old city of Jerusalem was, of course, in Jordan, rather than in the western part of Israel itself. I'm not here to speak about the Garden Tomb. I wasn't incidentally chairman of it. I was its president for about 6 years or so before I stood down about 18 months ago. And before that, I'd been its vice chairman for a very long time. I couldn't take on the position of chairmanship because I was still in post and didn't feel I could give that the sort of time that it warranted. But I've been very closely involved, and it is, those of you who've been there will know, the most amazing place. It's an oasis in the middle of smelly, crowded, noisy old city of old Jerusalem. And it's a place not only of peace and calm, but a place where we have the enormous privilege of telling the story of Jesus and the resurrection to just all kinds of people. I've taken around the most amazing people over the years. Everyone is as important as anyone else. But, you know, there are some people who've been significant leaders. I remember taking around the president of the World Bank, who was Jewish, and we spent 25 minutes talking about the very heart of the Christian gospel. And, you know, you cast your bread upon the waters and you pray and trust that it will return after many days. So as Ken says, Bridget and I have taken many groups to Israel over the years. We've lived there some short periods of time, a few months. I've only ever once been to Gaza, and that was to the Jabalia refugee camp, which is right in the north of the Gaza Strip. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And I have to say, I had the most amazing and wonderful, warm-hearted welcome from the people there, people who were suffering enormously. Now, clearly, I've got a view, everybody's got a view on the situation in Israel. I don't have any answers. Who on earth does at the moment? We're looking for a miracle of some sort, that's for sure. But miracles do happen. What I can, I think, do is share a few perspectives, as Ken puts it. I know there'll be people who've got very, very different views on the whole place of Israel in the Bible scheme of things, and the nation of Israel today as well. I've got loads of stuff I've written down here. Far too much to share with you today. I think I'm probably going to get going with some slides and just talk to them as they go through and see how we go on. Okay? Right, let's have the first one up if we may, Margaret, wherever you are. Okay? She's having problems with that as well, I think. Well, let me just say that, I mean, all of us find the current situation in Gaza totally and utterly heartrending. The destruction, the demolition, the death, the pain, the anguish just cries out to all of us. And we're in danger of getting compassion fatigue, really. There's no doubt about that. So every single one of us finds it heartbreaking. Many of us struggle to find how on earth it's come about, and we feel utterly helpless to do anything about it. Yes, we can pray. Yes, we can give. Some have been able to go, doctors, nurses, aid workers, reporters, journalists, all kinds of people at huge risk to their own lives as well. We can express our views to government, and at a time of election, that's certainly something we ought to be doing very much indeed. And to our church leaders, because we have to be honest and say many of them were very, very slow to make any comment at all on the Gaza situation, except to stress the government view that Israel has every right to defend itself. I personally think we should have had a more prophetic voice in the whole area. So we're all familiar with the scenes of distress and devastation and death. There are two pictures from the area that have gone viral over the years. I don't know, it looks as though Margaret's having problems and can't bring them up. So you've got to imagine them, I'm afraid. One is a picture you will have seen in the press. It's the picture of the nativity scene in the Lutheran church in Bethlehem. Munter Isaac, who is the Lutheran pastor there, created this nativity where you didn't have a baby in a hay-filled manger, but you had this doll within an area where there was rubble and stones and rubbish. And Munter Isaac said, if Jesus was born in Gaza today, he'd be born under the rubble. And he went on to say that Gaza is at the moment the moral compass of the world. It's very significant that that area has such an impact. It's almost an atavistic thing, isn't it? It's such a tiny country, Israel. It's only slightly larger than Wales in total. The Gaza Strip that we're talking about is actually smaller than the Isle of Wight. The population of the Isle of Wight is 141,600. The population in Gaza is almost 2.5 million. And it's been described as the largest open-air prison on earth because it has this huge boundary wall. But there's another one which went viral. It featured as the World Press Photograph of the Year in 2023. It was of a Palestinian woman in Gaza dressed in blue, holding a child wrapped in white in her arms. The difference was, of course, that the child was dead, and she was just so distressed and mourning. And what was evocative about the picture is that is how Jesus is depicted with his mother Mary so often. Mary dressed in blue, holding a young baby. And here was a picture which didn't spell out hope and joy for the world, but absolute despair and terror and fear. This is something Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said in May 2021. If there is a hell on earth, it is the lives of the children in Gaza. And Desmond Tutu, there are lots of comments about the situation from different leaders. Desmond Tutu, just before he died, towards the end of 2021, he said, from his experience of South Africa, I've condemned those in Palestine responsible for firing missiles and rockets at Israel. They're fanning the flames of hatred. I'm opposed to all manifestations of violence, but we must be very clear that the people of Palestine have every right to struggle for their dignity and freedom. It's a struggle that has the support of many around the world. Let's go on. And again, he said, I know firsthand that Israel has created an apartheid reality within its borders and through its occupation. The parallels to my own beloved South Africa are painfully stark. Now there speaks the voice of a mature Christian leader who knew what apartheid was like at first hand. Let's keep going, Margaret. And again later he said, the end of apartheid stands as one of the crowning accomplishments of the last century, but we would not have succeeded without the help of international pressure. If apartheid ended, so can the occupation, but the moral force and international pressure will have to be just as determined. The current divestment effort is the first, though certainly not the only necessary move in that direction. I'm going to move on through these various comments fairly quickly. Naledi Pandor, South Africa's Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, said this: Pretoria believes Israel should be classified as an apartheid state and that the United Nations General Assembly should establish a committee to verify whether it satisfies the requirements. So those are comments, and later he said, I'm deeply concerned about the clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing in Gaza. I keep going while I At a crucial moment like this, it's vital to be clear on principles, starting with the fundamental principle of respecting and protecting civilians. It's important to also recognize the attack by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 76 years of suffocating occupation. Now, whatever our views, and we have different views, there's no doubt that the attack on October the 7th by Hamas was savage, it was brutal, it was just unimaginably horrendous. They took 1,139 people, well, 1,139 were killed. They took another more than 200 hostage back into Gaza, and many of those were young children, some even babies in arms. And the horror is enormous anyway, but when you think of the number of children who've lost their lives in recent months, I mean, it is just absolutely heartbreaking. Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, said this in March this year: "There are reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold indicating the commission of the crime of genocide against Palestinians as a group in Gaza has been met." So we're talking about, according to leaders, international leaders around the world, occupation, oppression, hell on earth, apartheid, possibly even genocide. And the ICC response to that was to say at least some of the acts and omissions alleged by South Africa to have been committed by Israel in Gaza appear to be capable of falling within the provisions of the Genocide Convention. They've never responded and said it was actually genocide, but that's an issue which is being discussed everywhere. And then Karim Khan, the International Criminal Court top prosecutor, has very recently, you will know, requested arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, as well as for the 3 Hamas leaders. If the court accedes to that request, it puts Netanyahu at the risk of immediate arrest in the 124 countries that recognize the ICC's jurisdiction. Now, Guterres, when he said that what happened on October the 7th didn't happen in a vacuum, was pilloried everywhere in the press for daring to say such a thing. But we've got to put the thing in context. I'm not defending what Hamas did, it's horrendous. But nevertheless, there's a people who have been absolutely oppressed ever since the founding of the State of Israel and before. Let's zoom in on Gaza itself, okay? It's an area which is the Gaza Strip. I said that the whole of Israel is just slightly larger than Wales. The Gaza Strip is smaller than the Isle of Wight. It's 25 miles from north to south. The width for most of it is about 3.5 miles, and then it broadens around Rafah in the south to nearly 7.5 miles. And within that area, there are nearly 2.5 million people. Right at the beginning of the war, Israel distributed maps which had divided that area into more than 600 zones, little squares, as if they could then tell people where to move in and out of places they were going to bomb. Given that and the fact that communications were down, phones didn't work, people couldn't move that quickly and that easily. I mean, it was just a horrendous situation anyway. You can see there the urban areas. Gaza City is in the north, Rafah is in the south, Khan Yunis, where that picture came from with the woman holding the dead baby, that was in Khan Yunis, in the hospital there that was bombed by the Israelis. Let's move on. How do we understand what's happening? Let's go through these as quickly as we can. You've got to look at history, you've got to look at politics, you've got to look at religion. And it's a mixture of all three, and we can separate them from the point of view of analysis, but we certainly can't separate them in practice because they're all mixed together in an incredible hodgepodge. So how do we understand? Who owns the land? What is the historical background? Well, it's been owned by Assyria, by Greece, by Rome, by the Ottomans, by Britain, for a while, when it administered it, by Israel. Who owns the land? Some in Israel will say, well, we were there 2,000 years ago. It belongs, actually, 2,000 years ago, it was occupied, of course, by the Romans. Palestine, I don't know what you make of this, it will sound a provocative statement. Palestine has never been a country. It was an administrative district of the Roman Empire. Yes, I believe it ought to be a country, a state of its own. I'm not saying it shouldn't be. I'm saying it never actually has been, even though there are quite a number of countries around the world, and 3 recently in Europe, you will know, who've recognized Palestine as a state. But it's a state without borders, without control of its economy, without control of its energy supply, water, oil. It has no control over anything. So how can they be a free, independent state? At the moment, it's just it's a legal fiction to imagine that that is the case. So it's a mixture of history. How far do you go back? But then, of course, you're really into the whole political issue, aren't you? And that is a hodgepodge of so many things. Lawrence of Arabia, you will remember, it was around that period of the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire was defeated at the beginning of the First World War by Britain, and Britain persuaded the Arabs to support us in attacking the Turks in exchange for a promise. And they also, I'll say something about the promise in a minute, but they also seconded T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, to work with the Arabs, help them in the revolt, the Arab revolt. He was a pretty tortured character in any case, but I think I've got up what he then said subsequently. If you move on, Margaret. He said he felt continually and bitterly ashamed of the betrayal by the British. So Lawrence, fighting for them, and the reason why he was ashamed was because of the Balfour Declaration. Let's move on to it, if it's the next one. I don't know if it is. No, well, there you are. British Mandate Palestine. From 1920 onwards, the League of Nations designated the whole of that area of the Middle East to Britain, to mandate it to be in charge of it. It originally included the area of Transjordan, you can see there, and that then subsequently in the 20s became the separate kingdom of Jordan, which it now is. A lot of Israelis were desperately angered by that, because it was taking away a part of the land that they were sure was theirs by rightful inheritance. Let's go on. Here's the Balfour Declaration, which the Foreign Secretary, he had been Prime Minister, of course, but Arthur Balfour sent this letter to Lord Rothschild asking him to pass it on to the leader of the Zionist Federation. I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. I should be grateful if you bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Okay? His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement or the object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. What had happened was that in the days towards the end of the Arab revolt, Britain had promised to the Arabs, who were within the Ottoman Empire, that they could have a state of their own, which would certainly include the area which was known as Palestine because it was a Roman administrative district. So they promised Palestine, in inverted commas, to the Arabs. They spoke to the French and said that in cooperation with the League of Nations and others, it's going to be a territory administered internationally by us. You, the French, can have Syria and Lebanon. We will have Israel, as it were, Palestine, and at the time, Jordan. What they certainly provided a homeland for the Jewish people, but they've done nothing to protect the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. Now, the way that's worded, it suggests that the non-Jewish communities were actually quite small. They were 90% of the population, okay? So you had people coming to set up a Jewish homeland, and the old sort of lie that basically you and this was very much within the original Zionist aspiration, that a people without a land were going to a land without a people, is just totally and utterly untrue. There were many people living there. In the days of the Ottomans, there were something like 10,000 Jewish people living there, and there have always been Jewish people living there too. But the second half of the Balfour Declaration has never been implemented by us as British, and having promised the same area of land 3 different ways, that's nothing, I think, short of duplicitous. And I believe we should encourage our government, there is a movement to do that, to act on the second half of the Balfour Declaration. Let's move on. Palestine was among several former Ottoman territories placed under British control by the League of Nations. The mandate lasted until 1948. Let's keep going, Margaret. That's the period. Let's go on, sorry. During the British Mandate, this is a summary because life is going, more waves of Jewish immigration. There were Arab acts of violence which began in earnest in 1920. There was, of course, the Nazi persecution. There was of European Jews, Romania, Poland, Russia, Holocaust. The Jews in Palestine mounted a rescue operation. And to begin with, the British who were in control of that part of the world, were encouraging Jewish people to come to emigrate to Israel, as they wanted it to be. But there came a period when that was difficult because of the warring factions, and you had the incredible situation of Britain, who had helped to rescue Jewish people from the concentration camps, actually turning away the boats that brought them to Israel and leaving them to their own devices. So they were turned away. Let's move on. The UN proposal in 1947, they dividing Palestine into Jewish and Arab states with Jerusalem as an international city, a plan rejected by Jewish leaders, accepted by Jewish leaders, but rejected by the Arabs and never implemented. I'm going to race through, please, Margaret. Let's go on. That was a partition plan. You can see the Arab state in sort of a browny orange, and the Jewish state as proposed by the UN partition plan in 1947, with Jerusalem in the middle as an international city. We move on. After Britain withdrew and the Jews declared the State of Israel in 1948, war broke out with the neighboring Arab nations, and 8 months later the armistice line was agreed. Let's move on. I'm going to go beyond it, sorry. Then you come to the Six-Day War in 1967. Israel made huge territorial gains in that war. It was a preemptive strike, really, because they got wind of the fact that Egypt and Syria and Jordan were beginning to sort of plan an attack. So there was a preemptive strike. The Six-Day War, they captured the West Bank, including Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the whole Sinai Peninsula. So that was handed back to Egypt later on. So what effectively that did was wipe any possibility of a Palestinian country, state, completely off the map, because the whole area of what might be called Israel was in the hands of others, and you can see it very clearly there. Israel won the Sinai and the whole of the West Bank, and the strip at the top with the Golan Heights, which they're never likely to give up. Let's run through. Today, there have been several recent wars and a whole patchwork of attempts to solve the refugee problem. 2 Palestinian intifadas, one in the 80s and another at the beginning of this millennium, 2001. There has been terrorism on both sides. There have been Jewish settlements in the West Bank, handing over the Gaza Strip to Egypt, and then, to the Palestinians eventually, and the erection of the controversial barrier. I wish I got time to spell all this out. Let's go right through. Come on. Desmond Tutu again. The end of apartheid stands as one of the crowning accomplishments, I put this on earlier too, of the last century. We would not have succeeded without the help of international pressure. And whatever is needed today is that sort of coming together, certainly of all the Western nations, in order to put some sort of pressure on the government. We move on. Then you come to the whole issue of religion. Gosh, isn't that complicated? I wish I could say more about the political background, but religion, let's move on. God and Gaza, okay. If only it was so simple as blaming one side rather than the other. The thing is, you've got a group of evil people who are committing absolute atrocities, and if only we could get rid of them and deal with them, all would be well, wouldn't it? Except life isn't like this. This is Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag Archipelago. If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. Let's go on. In order to have some idea of the significance of religion, you've got to go right the way back to the promises made to Abraham. We'll quickly move through this. It was a promise of a great nation. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. The promise to Abraham of a great nation, okay, a great family. I will bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. So a nation and a people, a great land. To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt, the Nile, to the great river, the Euphrates. Incidentally, I've never, ever heard anyone argue, even the most ardent Jewish Israeli, that that is the land they ought to have. But that was the promise. What would it include? Lebanon, Syria, Kuwait, Jordan, right the way, Iraq, right the way over to the Euphrates. Really? Where does a literal interpretation of Scripture get you is an interesting question. Let's move on. A blessing to the whole world. Through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed. You've then got to move on, I'm afraid, to the whole issue of Zionism, because that plays an enormous role in the whole picture today. I'm going to keep moving through, Margaret. If you think of the close relationship that there is still between Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden, what's the reason for that? The reason for that is to do with Zionism. I wish I got time to say, but of course many of the British people at the time of the Balfour Declaration, a century before, many of them were Zionist in outlook. There was a wave of excitement in the government, in government circles in this country, about the Jews beginning to return to their own land, and this was heralding the end of time and the return of Christ and all the rest of it. That's certainly true of Zionists everywhere. What Zionists believe, here's a man called John Hagee, who's a very significant pastor in the States of the Cornerstone Church. He also leads an organization called Christians United for Israel. Carry on. He believes that the Bible commands Christians to support the state of Israel. And on we go. Benjamin Netanyahu said recently, I don't believe that the Jewish state and modern Zionism would have been possible without Christian Zionism. We value our friends and never forget them. What is the Zionist view? The Zionist view is that the modern state of Israel is the inheritor of all the promises of Abraham. The land, the people, absolutely everything belongs to them, even though it's a secular state. And Benjamin Netanyahu will get into quoting Scripture, as he did very recently, when he sort of claim scriptural warrant with the sort of eradication of Amalek. Can we move on? Well, I better say this. This is something John Hagee said. The sleeping giant of Christian Zionism has awakened. 50 million Christians standing up and applauding Israel. Think of the future together. 50 million evangelicals joining in common cause with 5 million Jewish people in America on behalf of Israel is a match made in heaven. Zionists, 10% of Zionists in the world today are Jewish. 90%, probably slightly more, are Christian Zionists, many of them in the southern states of America, who believe exactly what I put up about John Hagee, that all the promises apply to the state of Israel today. Let's move on very quickly through. I wish I got time to say a lot more. Wherever you start, whether you say what we need is some sort of answer, whether you say how do we cope with the suffering, whether you say what about the evil that is absolutely condensed into that part of the world, without saying who's to blame, because there's this long history of occupation and oppression, as well as the recent atrocities. And while you don't defend any of the atrocities in any way at all, you can understand why people who've got the heel of a boot on their neck all the time, in the end, hit out. It's not right, it's horrendous, it's to be condemned. But you can understand, even if you don't sort of say that it should have happened. All of this leads us in the end to the cross. Where is God in Gaza? To go back to what I was saying right at the beginning, Munter Isaac said he'd be born under the rubble. He said that it's a hell on earth there, and that Gaza is the moral compass of the world. There's something about this small nation. Why is it that there are protests all over the world at the moment over this nation, when there are battles, hostility, conflict, horrendous things happening in many parts of the world? This is so strategic geographically. Somebody described it as the buckle on the belt, which binds together east and west and north and south, because it's the route to Asia, to Africa, from Europe. But it's more than geographical. It has a huge significance for us, in the sense that we all feel a degree of involvement with that part of the world. The story of Jesus is a story that we live in. It's a story that is our story. It's not just a bit of history. It is our story as we relate to Jesus and walk with him. And in a way that we'll never understand, what happens there just has an impact on the whole world. And the answer to it, well, of course, we want people to do all sorts of things. As I said at the beginning, to give, to go, to make representation, to perhaps make sure you don't buy Israeli goods and that sort of thing. But the answer, which we'll never understand, is in the cross of Jesus Christ. That's where evil has actually been dealt with once and for all. The repercussions go on. Okay, we're celebrating D-Day, and this was D-Day for the whole world, if you like, in a spiritual sense, when Jesus died on the cross. The significance of it didn't end the war, as it were, but it was the destructive sort of definitive battle over evil. If you want to know who's the most evil person in the world today, or has been, was it Stalin? Was it, I don't know, you could reel off a whole host of people. Was it Hitler? I'll tell you who was the most evil person the world has ever seen, and that was Jesus Christ, as he hung on the cross in a place called Calvary, because we're told that he bore and absorbed into himself the evil, the pain, the agony, the anguish of the world. I mean, there are lots of problems about suffering. People don't want an explanation. They don't want an argument. They want a shoulder to cry on. They want support. They want help. And that's what people are desperately crying out for in Gaza today. Sorry, I've gone on too long. I haven't said half the things I wanted to say. It's just a bit of an insight into the whole situation, which should involve us, all of us, more than it does. Jesus died on a cross, and what we need to do is come and stand at the foot of the cross as Christians and cry out with the cries of the psalmist, Lord, how long? Please, please, God. We want to do everything we can. Please, can this come to an end? Benjamin Netanyahu is totally unpopular in Israel. Mr. Security didn't prevent what he should have foreseen, this incredible attack. His days are undoubtedly numbered. There are also all sorts of criminal charges against him. The leader of Fatah, which is the major Palestinian political party, Mahmoud Abbas, is 88. He's not going to last for very long, and you don't hear very much about him these days. What you do hear about is that the rival party, which subsequently became elected in Gaza, which was Hamas. Just plead with God, stand at the cross, and plead with him, Lord, how long? Thanks for listening. Questions, please.
Graham.
It's not a question, but it might be helpful if people checked out Lance Lambert and his books. Lance is now dead. He's a Jew,
Yep.
a believer. You probably know about him. But he wrote some very interesting books. The Uniqueness of Israel, which goes into the fauna, the flora, all the rest of it, in where it happens in Israel. Also, Battle for Israel, the spiritual side of the Six-Day War. Also, if you can get hold of them, because I've got a lot of it on tape, unfortunately, his reports on Israel, which came to Intercessors for Britain in the 1980s, are very interesting. He also was an advisor to the Israeli government. I just recommend him. And also, Michael Youssef, who's an Egyptian believer who lives in America, he's written a book about how to read the Bible, and he touches on some of these things. It's very interesting. Yeah. But I recommend all that to you to check it out.
Yeah, fine. Thank you ever so much. Lance Lambert's books. Yeah.
Okay. Other comments?
Thank you for what you have explained. I just want to ask you, you talk about God. For me, that is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So do you believe that the rebirth of Israel in 1948 was prophetic fulfillment?
Gosh, that's a huge question, isn't it? And people will have different views on that. I think that what lies behind it is how do you begin to interpret Scripture on some of these complicated issues. If you interpret it all literally, as I hinted, when you get the promise from the Nile to the Euphrates, you'd have a larger Israel if they really took that literally. But even the Zionists are selective. They take some parts literally and not others. So is the present state of Israel a move to the fulfillment of biblical prophecy? Personally, I do not think so. Now, that's an opinion, and I would argue for it, and I'm not going to, I don't want to be controversial, please, I don't. It's a question of how, when the Bible talks about the land, for example, which is a key issue, they were going back to the land, and the land that they really want, of course, is the heart of the West Bank, Samaria, Hebron, all the biblical sites, and the Judean hills, not the coastal region. The land, which is so prominent. Now, the prophetic view takes a literal interpretation of the land and the return to it. I want to say we always read the Old Testament through the lens of the New. Jesus never says a single thing about the land of Israel. The only time the word is used is in the Sermon on the Mount, when we're told the meek shall inherit the earth. And I don't think for a moment that means the land of Israel. What Jesus talked about was a kingdom with no boundaries, where you need no passports, there are no language problems. It is a spiritual kingdom. And remember the bit that the prophetic view misses out, in a way, is the last part of the promise to Abraham, which is that you are there for the blessing of the whole world. Israel was meant to be people through whom God worked to bless the world. That's not an answer, but it's a response.
Thank you. One other question, and I've got one or two final comments. Another question at all? Thank you, Anna.
Thank you for your talk. What I wanted to ask, the people of Gaza voted Hamas in government? I'm not sure.
Hamas is the elected government of Gaza, yes.
Would you happen to advise us, do you have any knowledge of what Hamas objectives are?
Hamas's objectives are the division between the two political parties, Fatah, which was its predecessor was the PLO, but of course you say the word PLO and you immediately think terrorist, which wasn't necessarily the case. But Fatah became the main Palestinian party, the rival party, and they almost got into a civil war as well as political disagreement at one stage. Was Hamas, which emerged really this century, this millennium, after the Second Intifada. Hamas, which is an Islamic jihadist Muslim, undoubtedly terrorist organization, is absolutely committed to the elimination of Israel, just as Benjamin Netanyahu is committed to the elimination of Hamas.
John, just one question which we haven't talked about particularly. Am I okay? I'm in vision, Nishi. Thank you. Is something called replacement theology.
Yeah.
Now, we haven't talked about that.
No.
Could you say just in a moment what that is and how that overlaps, perhaps, with a broader thinking about the place of the Jewish people?
Replacement theology is basically the view that God dealt with the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel in the Old Testament. They failed, and he's rejected the Jewish people in favor of the new Israel, which is the people of God in Christ. That's replacement theology, replacing Israel with the Christian church. I think that's anathema, frankly. I certainly wouldn't go in that direction in any way at all. What I would describe is fulfillment theology. Paul, in his writings, we tend to think of him dealing with Israel just in Romans 9 to 11. Pretty well all his letters are written with the backcloth of the whole issue of Israel and the rest of the nations, the Gentiles. And he's constantly wanting to reiterate that there are people who become believers in the true God in Jesus as Messiah within Israel. So the successors, you can't even call them that, it's difficult to describe, isn't it? But the furthering of his purpose with the Jewish people is within a new created entity, which is Jewish believers as well as Christians. So it's Jews and Christians. And the question then becomes how you interpret the passage in Romans, which looks forward to the time when all Israel shall be saved. And that's not an easy passage I haven't got time to try and expound it now, but does it mean the nation of Israel? Does it mean the Israelites? Does it mean Jewish people? And what do you mean by Jewish people anyway? I stood on the steps of a tribunal I went to in London some while ago, and as I was waiting, someone else came up, a man, and we got chatting. He was a Jewish academic. He'd just given a lecture at SOAS. He was a secular Jew, and he'd come to support someone who was being accused of anti-Semitism. He was coming to speak up in his defense. And I said to him, well, if you're a secular Jew, you're a Jew by race, aren't you, rather than religion? And he said, I am a Jew by birth. What does it mean to be Jewish? Is it a race? Is it a culturally determined thing? Is it an ethnic thing? Exactly what it's very difficult, isn't it? But it's very significant because anyone who can give any sort of evidence of a birth link to a Jewish past is welcome now to go to Israel, be a full member, buy a house, be a citizen, election rights and all the rest of it. The people who used to live there, who are Arabs, who still have the keys to their houses where they were either kicked out or fled in fear, are not allowed back. They're living in Lebanon, they're living in Jordan, many of them, some in Egypt, and some, of course, still in Gaza and elsewhere. But the people who originally lived there are no longer welcome, and they have no right of return. And anyone who can claim a Jewish link in their family, wherever they are in the world, and whether they've ever been to Israel or not, is immediately welcomed as a full citizen. Now, that's not right, is it?
I think, John, we must finish in a moment. The tension that, I've thought about this for ages too, and been 5 times to Israel, is a tension between the fulfillment of the promises relating to God's special Jewish people on the one side, and the modern Israeli state territorially on the other side. And that, I think, is difficult. Last story. Some people here at St Paul's have heard me tell this story. On one of my visits to Israel with my students from school trip, floating in the Dead Sea, as you do, a well-spoken Arab floated up against me, and he said the word that every teacher dreads: "Are you in charge of these children?" And so he said, "Did you go to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem?" Some of you have been there. And I said, "Well, we went to the children's wing of Yad Vashem." And he just said this, it's quite a few years ago now, he just said, "Do you know, I'm a doctor on the West Bank, in Nablus. I can't go one city block in my hometown without being challenged by an Israeli soldier and asked to show my pass. This is our land too. We need to learn to live together." I never forgot that. In one minute, 2-minute conversation, the traumas of the Middle East and its history were summarized in that one thing. John, thank you for coming today. Let's give him another round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, dear brother.